I am Lynn Bacani. This is Maritime Viewpoints on Marino World Online. Joining us from UK is Mr. Francesco Gargiulo, Chief Executive Officer of IMEC. Established over 70 years back, the International Maritime Employers Council operates from UK and Manila, Philippines, and represents 250 shipping companies with 11,200 vessels of 60 flags, over 300,000 seafarers of 68 nationalities. Members are individual shipping companies, both owners and managers, large and small, operating all types of ships, including dry bulk, container, cruise liners, livestock carriers, reefers, and tankers. IMEC runs one of the most outstanding cadet programs in the Philippines and is dedicated to the long-term supply of world-class seafarers. Welcome to the program, Mr. Gargiulo. Thank you for joining from UK.
Thank you for having me, Lynn. It's a pleasure to participate and to be able to perhaps tell you more about what IMEC does and have perhaps a nice chat about how that's changed with COVID.
Francesco, how's IMEC operating now its cadetship program? Did COVID-19 pandemic change your priorities?
In a way, it's made us focus more on the future. MAP, which is where obviously we operate the cadet program from, we're able to actually continue working and continue operating throughout the pandemic. It's one of the very few colleges that actually did not close in the Philippines during the pandemic. And that obviously has given us an opportunity to think about how the future is going to look like in terms of marine training and education. And thanks to MAP's proactive approach to the pandemic, we were able to keep the students in class. We were able to turn our face-to-face training into remote training, and we were able to develop technical solutions that allow them to continue their education, to continue their training throughout this crisis. Of course, part of the marine education program is an apprenticeship at sea, spent on ships, and that's where we've had most of our challenges, and that's where our program has had to change. We run a program that has a sea phase, i.e. a phase in which the cadets are placed on a vessel for training in the middle of their course, in the middle of their 4.5 years course. And in many cases, because of the crew change crisis, our cadets were unable to join a vessel. And so we've had to adjust. And kudos to Admiral Santos and MAP, because they were very flexible and were able to help. So not only did they set up a number of additional activities and a number of online classes for our cadets, and were able to isolate them from the virus, they were also able to accommodate this change of plans. We were able to push cadets into doing their final year ahead of the sea phase, so that we basically pushed back the requirement for them to join a vessel at some point in 2020. And of course, what that means is that this year we're going to have a whole lot more cadets in college than you would have expected. But again, that's something that our partners in MAP have been able to accommodate.
How about your programs for the trainers?
One of the things we were going to do this year was to address some of the concerns expressed by our members with regards to the preparedness of Filipino-based trainers to deliver online courses, to deliver remote learning experiences. And so we had, before the pandemic already, we had partnered with Solon University here in Southampton, and we were going to deliver a train-the-trainer course for trainers that were employed in training centers that are operated by our members in Manila. What the pandemic did was to push the agenda a little bit further than we had originally planned. So not only did we deliver the train-the-trainer course, but we actually delivered it remotely. And the focus went specifically on delivering remote learning sessions. So in hindsight, particularly from this perspective, the pandemic was a good thing for us because we were able to branch a little bit further in the future than we had originally planned. It was a great success. The feedback from all the trainers that participated in this train the trainer course was excellent. We're now busy planning the next phase, where we're going to provide them with some additional learnings, as well as focus on other trainers. I mean, the intention is to obviously try and enhance the skills of Philippine-based trainers to be able to deliver and plan online remote learning sessions going forward.
And indeed, IMEC is a big organization and you have a strong voice, influence in the global shipping community. How are you cooperating now with other NGOs, also with UN agencies such as ILO and IMO?
Obviously, the pandemic had a lot of negative effects. I mean, the crew change crisis is probably the biggest negative effect out there. However, out of all this crisis, something that was very positive as far as IMEC is concerned, but also as far as the maritime industry is concerned, was the unity that the industry showed to the whole world. And I must, kudos here need to go to ICS, the International Chamber of Shipping, because they were the ones who coordinated the views of the industry. And we worked with them and with a large number, actually, of other NGOs and national shipowners associations and so on and so forth in what became a fairly established industry forum. And that actually was the conduit, was the means to reach out to the ILO and the IMO, to the UN agencies, and open a dialogue that the likes of which have never seen before. So through this conduit, we were able to actually approach the ILO and the IMO and ask for their help and their support in this crisis. We worked with all these organizations, as well as the ILO and the IMO, to establish what was then the IMO protocol for crew changes, or safe crew changes, which was published in May this year. And there's been a lot of activities. I mean, the IMO and the ILO have established a task force, which we work with, we liaise with whenever there are particular crises that we are unable to solve ourselves, either ourselves or as a joint up group. And so that's a way to perhaps exercise a little bit of pressure on some of the countries that are not being as proactive as others when it comes to resolving some of the crises that we have experienced in terms of crew changes. So for us, the COVID actually gave us a platform from which to talk to the likes of IMO and ILO. And at the same time, it gave them access to the goal face, to people that basically operate on a daily basis in the shipping industry. Sometimes the IMO and the ILO have been accused of being a little bit theoretical and bureaucratical and a little bit distant from the industry. So this gave them the opportunity to have access to our experiences and our views and our thoughts, as well as give us the opportunity to let them know what our priorities are, what our concerns are, what our problems are. And we work together really well. Of course, IMEC is not an IMO and ILO accredited NGO. So the crisis gave us access to them more so than ever before in the past, through obviously the ICS and their arrangements, their calls. I've had 2, 3, 4 weekly calls since March, since when the crisis started, and I know a lot more about our colleagues in other NGOs and other national shipowners associations than I did before. That's for sure. So that was quite a positive.
And you are also a signatory of the Neptune Declaration, right?
Yes, we are. In fact, IMEC did a lot of lobbying, both at the national and international level, through our members, through the Secretariat, through the ICS-led task force on crew changes. We wrote letters to prime ministers, we wrote letters to presidents, and letters to the G20, letters to the G7. We basically tried to raise the profile of the industry and of the problems the industry is facing, i.e. the challenges we are having with crew change in particular. We even had the Pope intercede for seafarers at some point during the early part of the crisis. The Neptune Declaration is just another one of those initiatives, and our chairman, Captain Belal, is a signatory of the one of the early signatory of the Neptune Declaration, which, let's be completely honest and transparent about this, that's not massively different from all the lobbying the industry did in the preceding months. I suppose the one thing that makes the Neptune Declaration a little bit different from all other lobbying efforts is that this time we've been joined by some of the charterers, because I think one of the early challenges we had with our lobbying efforts was that whilst ship owners and ship managers and crew managers, the maritime employers we represent, were committed to resolving the crisis, there was a little bit of a resistance on the part of the charterers, the people that actually decide where the ships go. And so we had absurd situations whereby we were trying to facilitate crew changes for seafarers that have been stuck at sea for like 18 months. And the charters who were the ones dictating where the ships go were not allowing deviations that would have allowed those crew changes. And so that brought about a number of conversations. So if the Neptune Declaration is different in any way from the previous lobbying we've all been doing from the beginning, that is that it involves a number of charters, a number of people that have decided to be part of this coalition of the willing to solve the problem rather than sit on the side of the river there. And
how about your dialogues with the unions?
Well, you see, when we started working together with ICS and Intertank and Intermanager and Intercargo and so on and so forth, everybody sort of tried to lend their expertise to the common effort. And I suppose IMEC's role was of the organization that has the ongoing relationship with the ITF and its affiliate unions. So in a way, we became the conduit for the group to deal with the unions, to talk to the unions. Of course, I mean, the likes of ICS has its own relationship with the ITF, and that's great. The difference there being that we were, I suppose, bringing a bit more of the day-to-day operational aspects of that relationship to the table. And so we were able to, work with the unions on trying to find solutions to the problem, but at the same time, mitigate some of their more extreme views when it comes to addressing the issue. And perhaps that this is, in a way, how strikes and other more extreme actions were avoided, because a number of people with a steady approach to things got together, on both sides, on both the ITF side and IMEC side, and we actually worked really well together. We achieved quite a few successes in this process, and of course that turned into a weekly meeting. So and that still goes on. We still have a weekly meeting every Thursday. We meet with the senior leadership of ITF and discuss the most recent challenges and try and work on common solutions, agreed solutions. Of course, that doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. That doesn't mean that we see things the same way. But particularly during this crisis, I think it's been essential that the two sides have sat together around the table, a virtual table in this case, and found solutions rather than bicker about problems.
Mm-hmm. And I understand you have this quarantine and testing projects with ITF.
Yeah, that's something we're very proud of, and that's one of those solutions I was talking about when I said about our interaction with the unions. I mean, where this started from, and this is it's the brainchild of our chairman, Captain Belal. Basically, we had a situation whereby, if you recall, early on in the crisis, there was a fairly strong reaction by Singapore to a number of Filipino seafarers turning up in Singapore, having tested negative back in the Philippines, turning out to be positive to the virus by the time they arrived into Singapore. And obviously the perception there was that they would be spreading the virus around. So the immediate reaction from Singapore was a fairly draconian one, if I'm honest, where they closed to all crew changes. And I suppose part of the work we did was to put something together that would convince a number of governments to let seafarers come into their country that had been through a certified quarantine process, because some of the challenges that were experienced at the time were that people's quarantines were not being adhered to strictly when it comes to, in the example that was quoted, Filipino seafarers that had spent their time at home unable to properly isolate. Also, there were issues with falsification of certificates, of COVID negative certificates. And so the idea came that we should perhaps put something together as an industry or as an industry body, work with the unions. And in this particular case, we worked very closely with AMSUP, which is one of the ITF affiliates in the Philippines, to set up a facility that would, have a number of strict protocols that seafarers should adhere to, and B, had a third party overseeing the operation. What we wanted to do basically is to give some of the countries that started to become twitchy and nervous about Filipino joining some assurances about how the quarantine was being conducted back in the Philippines. And that's how we started out with a couple of hotels in Manila. The St. Giles now is our main focus. And basically, we established this quarantine facility, which was operated by AMSUP on behalf of the group, on behalf of ITF and IMEC, and was funded actually in a number of cases by a training fund that is one of the training funds that comes from our collective agreements, the agreements that we negotiate with AMSUP in this particular case. What we then did was to reach out to our membership and offer that facility at a severely discounted rate. And with that facility, offer them assurances that countries like Singapore would be more willing to receive joiners that came from such facilities. We partnered with the SG Star Fund in Singapore. In fact, IMEC and ITF both joined the fund and joined the task force that started working on what they call upstream solutions. The fund is based in Singapore, but its focus is global. They're looking at making sure that manpower supply countries are provided with tools to be able to provide a safe manpower supply. And so initiatives like our quarantine facility in Manila were essential in providing both governments and organizations with the assurances they were looking for as far as the pandemic is concerned. We also partnered up with a software provider that was based in Hong Kong, which basically provided an encryption facility, blockchain facility for the certificates, so that they could be made tamper-proof. And so there would be no more doubts about the veracity of some of the certificates that our seafarers were showing up with. 3 months down the line, the initiative has been a great success. And I suppose the biggest success for the quarantine facility in Manila is that, we've had around 4.5% to 5% of positive cases. People that tested positive either when they arrived at the facility and they were first tested, or during the quarantine period, which is exactly the reason why we do a second test during this quarantine period. So the more significant ones are the portion of seafarers that tested positive during the second test, because these are seafarers that in the normal process would have ended up on a ship with the virus and would have infected the whole ship, would have created major issues. We're happy to report that, as I said, 3 months down the line, having captured around 5% of positive cases, we've had 0 reports of seafarers joining a vessel and being positive, having been through our facility, which I think is a sign of our success. And the other thing that obviously came out of this is that the likes of Singapore became confident enough in our facilities and our processes as to provide us with enhanced access to the country. You would normally need to, when you plan a crew change, you'd have to give them 2 weeks notice. Well, if you come from our facilities, you only needed a week notice. And if there was a change of seafarer for whatever reason that was due to join in at a particular date, as long as the replacement for that seafarer came from the facility, the notice could be even less. So those are the sort of things that we managed to achieve with the facility. So we gave a lot of countries confidence that the seafarers that were being deployed were clean seafarers. And at the same time, we gave some of our members the ability to utilize a facility that was cheap, because we're talking about $35, $36 a day for a hotel and 3 meals a day served in the room, with all the other things that come with it, the monitoring and the transport and so on and so forth. So very cost effective at the time where cost is an issue, because let's not hide behind the bushes here. The pandemic has added huge cost to the process of crew changes as far as our members are concerned. And so trying to limit as much as possible what these additional costs was a key priority for us.
How are your members reacting on the protocols being implemented here in the Philippines, the crew change protocols, the green lanes?
Well, we obviously have tried to influence those protocols as much as we can through the ICS, obviously, and through the ICS task force. We have our own relationships in the Philippines, but ultimately the official channel that we used to put across our approval or discontent with a particular process has been the ICS task force, and that's been useful. If I'm completely honest, to begin with, there were some frustrations, and the process was slow, and it was complicated, more complicated than perhaps we felt it should have been. But we got to a point where we worked well together with the local administration. And that's a pleasing aspect of all this operation, if I'm honest. There's always going to be things that we disagree on, but by and large, we have a good relationship with the local administration. We've been able to influence some of their decisions, and they've listened to some of our suggestions when they made sense. Let's put it this way. So it's a good dialogue.
mandatory? What's your take on this or that of IMEC?
It's a complicated one. And once again, a big shout out to ICS, because they embraced their leadership position in the shipping industry and they coordinated a task force that includes some of the same people that were in the task force for crew changes, some of the same organizations, I mean, and under the stewardship of Natalie Shaw, which is the Director of Labour Affairs in the ICS, where we're doing a lot of work on vaccinations and a lot of work on what the legal, moral, and ethical implications of vaccinations are going to be, and operational, actually. So the task force is exploring a lot of the questions you were asking, a lot of the questions about whether it should be mandatory, whether there should be a travel passport. I mean, I'll take it slow there and go through the key achievements. The task force is obviously trying to provide visibility in terms of who is ordered what vaccines. Is trying to also lobby countries at this stage not to make vaccination mandatory. We have concerns about this turning into a requirement like yellow fever was for certain countries back in the day, because of the severe shortage of vaccines. So making it a requirement for travel when there isn't enough vaccines to go around, when a population like the Philippines of 110 millions is not going to get any vaccines really before the end of the spring, and seafarers are not really going to be in the first wave of people that are going to be vaccinated, would be suicidal, because obviously what we would end up doing is create another crew change crisis, because clearly if they can't travel, they can't crew change, and we go back to where we were 6, 7, 8 months ago with all the limitations and all the restrictions which created the initial crisis. Some of the conversations we're having are about making sure nobody takes a hard stance when it comes to requiring a vaccine. And some of the other conversations we're having is how do we help manpower supply country in particular, and manpower supply countries that may not benefit immediately from the new vaccines with achieving or obtaining some of these vaccines. There's obviously a United Nations WHO initiative, which is COVAX. I always forget how that's spelled. And that aims at basically obtaining 2 billion doses of vaccine for less developed countries. What we're trying to do is to try and carve out a space for seafarers, because let's face it, we're not talking about huge numbers. There's normally around 1.5 million seafarers at sea at any one time. So we're not talking about vaccinating huge population. And of course, some of these seafarers come from countries that are vaccinating right now and are doing really well. But of course, some of these seafarers are not. And our focus has been on trying to find ways to direct some of these COVAX vaccines towards seafarers, as well as trying to lobby countries, governments into considering seafarers as key workers, because let's face it, they are. Our biggest lobbying activity has been through the IMO and towards countries, trying to push them to declare seafarers key workers. Because let's face it, without seafarers, there's no shipping industry. Without shipping industry, 90% of the world trade stops. And people need to remember that, need to understand that this is the case. Seafarers are key workers. They were our heroes during the crisis because they kept going. Some of them never saw their families for 2 years and continue to deliver goods to the world, because with COVID, most things stopped, but international trade didn't. Our foods and our supplies, our medical supplies and everything else kept arriving. Our energy, our oil, all the things that make us live the way we live continue to come. And that's only thanks to seafarers who, despite being trapped on ships, despite not being able to go home, continue to do their job, continue to deliver for the world. And so these are the sort of lobbying efforts we continue to make sure that governments, A, recognize the importance of seafarers, and B, treat them accordingly, i.e. put them amongst the top priorities as far as the vaccination lists are concerned. So everybody understands that, the vulnerable and the elderly and the healthcare workers need to come first. But after that, we feel very strongly that seafarers should be the next group. And of course, some countries have done that. We hear that the countries like Slovenia and Romania, for example, are planning to vaccinate seafarers. We hear, of course, that countries like Singapore have put the shipping industry, the shipping cluster, at the forefront of their concerns, and they've already vaccinated a large number of seafarers. They've already vaccinated a large number of operators within the shipping industry, pilots, superintendents, but even people working in shipping companies. And that's the sort of example we would like the rest of the world to follow. We understand we're not alone. There's a lot of groups that feel that they are essential and they should be prioritized. But of course, we need to do the right thing for our industry, and our industry is vital to the world's economy. So it is important that we continue to push this angle. In terms of mandatory or non-mandatory, that's a very big ethical question. And we're doing a lot of work on trying to get to a position that is both fair and ethical, but at the same time workable. There's also a lot of conversations about liability. I mean, there's been talk of the industry buying a number of vaccines privately, which currently is not possible, buying them privately to be able to then distribute them to seafarers in countries where the government hasn't taken care of them because they haven't got enough for the elderly population, or they haven't got enough for the healthcare workers and so on and so forth. But those are all conversations that are going on, and there's a lot of complications with those conversations. I'm aware, for example, in the Philippines, there's been, 3 public-private partnerships whereby the government is, let's face it, at this stage, governments are the only ones who are able to purchase vaccines. So the only way for private organizations to gain a degree of control is to work with government. And that, I think that's what's happening in the Philippines. I know there's been an AstraZeneca project, there's been a Moderna initiative, and there's now a Novavax initiative. They're all offering a degree of access to private entities in the Philippines with different approaches. But those are the sort of solutions that we're looking to explore ourselves, because clearly, once we get to a point where the vaccines are available and they start being, people start being inoculated, we'd like seafarers to have access to some of them. And whether that's through the government or through a public-private partnerships or through a private purchase, which is currently far, far off in the distance, we want to make sure that manpower supplies are catered for. And one of the other things we are looking at, and that's and it's in infancy, is we're looking at hub ports whereby seafarers that are not they're not taken care, not inoculated in their own countries, can be captured in these hub ports. But again, this is currently it's a very futuristic view. It's not something that's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 months. But we need to be prepared for whatever future comes. Let's put it this way. So that's the sort of work we're doing in terms of vaccinations.
With regards to the deployment of our Filipino seafarers, Francesco, per IMEC statistics, how's the deployment or the employment of our seafarers, our Filipino seafarers, on board IMEC member vessels? Because POEA has just released a data compared to 2019. That's way below.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm very aware of those numbers. The reality here is that whilst at the beginning of the crisis, we had a firm grip on our numbers, and we kept, because ultimately one of the functions we performed within the ICS task force for crew changes was to provide them with real numbers, real life examples of what was going on the ground. And so we ran a number of surveys through our members. Of course, running these many surveys and the crisis going on and on and on and extended itself, made it very difficult for us to continue to access those numbers, because there was a bit of a survey fatigue amongst our members. Our members didn't really want to respond to any more surveys. So whilst we don't have an updated figure as far as the IMEC membership is concerned, I think the POEA numbers are very indicative of what is happening as far as the Philippines are concerned. As you said, they've issued numbers for 2020, and when you compare them to 2019, there's almost a 60% decrease in deployment. I mean, that is dramatic, to say the least. 60%. We're talking 300,000 jobs that went. Of course, if you want to look at this from an optimistic perspective, you say, well, a lot of this is cruise ships. Cruise ships have stopped. And of course, because of the cruise ship stopping, that's why the deployments are down so far as they appear to be. If you look at the numbers with a little bit more of a critical eye, then you realize that actually there is a little bit more to it that catches the eye. And I think one of the things that's been brewing for a while is that the Philippines is starting to price itself out of the market. I'm not talking about the wages, because the wages are in line with most other nationalities as far as, particularly we talk about ratings, which has been the dominion of Filipino seafarers for a long time. But now, if you look at a Filipino AB's wages and an Indian AB's wage or a Ukrainian AB's wages, there isn't a whole lot of difference in between them. What makes a difference, what makes people less happy than they used to be with the Filipino manpower sources, is all the ancillary costs, all the things that come with having to employ a Filipino seafarer. And there, I think that's where the numbers, if you look at them carefully, tell you a whole lot of the story. Because yes, of course, if you look at the numbers and you look at the months like March and April, of course, the deployments went almost to zero, because from your 45,000 average of the year before to 597 in March, or a little over 1,000 in April, if I remember correctly. This is the pandemic having its impact, because you couldn't get people out of the Philippines, you couldn't get people back to the Philippines. The problem here is that people during those moments went to alternative sources and found that those alternative sources worked. So some of the discontent that had been building up for years with some of the things that happen in the Philippines made them realize that perhaps there is a life outside of the Philippines when it comes to manning a particular vessel. And we hear a lot of stories from members about vessels that were planned to be Filipino top to bottom, who ended up being Indian top to bottom, who ended up being Ukrainian top to bottom. I mean, I was talking to a friend back in June, and they were telling me that they couldn't find a Ukrainian OS for love nor money. Every Ukrainian OS that was available there was snapped up and placed on board. Now, the danger with this, if the Philippines was a happy paradise and everything was hunky-dory, then people would go back to the Philippines once the crisis is over, once it's easy to get access to Filipino seafarers. But if there are other factors, other things that people are concerned about, then that's when people start thinking seriously about what the future looks like. And these other factors, they were there to begin with, because if you look at the deployments and you compare January and February, it's how before the pandemic, there was already a shortage of 15,000 placements, 15,000 deployments year on year. This is the sort of stuff that happens when people start seeing that the Filipino seafarer is pricing itself out of the market. How? You'd say, well, there's a lot of things that are happening in the Philippines which are not conducive to them continuing to be a great manpower supply, a qualified manpower supply source. Things like, the government focusing on increasing the cost of employers, the PhilHealth planned increase, the SSS planned increase. I have to say that I was pleased to see that the PhilHealth increase is now being put on hold on 1st of January 2021, because that was another nail in the coffin. And I hear there's talk of the SSS increase also being put on hold, because these are all additional costs that you don't have to encounter when you employ other nationalities. But I suppose the big elephant in the room here is the claim culture that has become synonymous with Filipino seafarers, unfortunately. And we love Filipino seafarers, and we have invested millions in our training programs. They're all based in the Philippines, or most of them are based in the Philippines, because we believe in the Philippines as a future source of manpower. But people need to understand that this claim culture, this ambulance chasing, is not doing the Philippines any favors. And this is a battle we've been fighting for the last 10 years. There's clearly a tendency to exploit some of the employers in the Philippines. And that's one of the things that has raised a lot of concerns. Now, there are potential solutions, but these solutions have been frustrated for years now. I've known of an escrow bill for as long as I've been in my position, and there's continuous talk about this escrow bill, but this escrow bill, which actually would be a major win in the war against fraudulent claims, continues to be put off and put back, and for one reason or another. Clearly, that is something that needs to be pushed, and it needs to be pushed quickly, because I think this is crisis, and I think that these numbers are not going to bounce back to the old level just because the pandemic goes away. People that have experienced other sources, people that have experienced Ukrainians and Indians and Vietnamese, are going to tend to want to stick to those, particularly because they realize there are no, or they're very negligible claim culture issues. And those are only some of the reasons, but those are really big, important reasons. And so people need to start understanding that, ship owners' principals, employers are not a cash cow, and they need to start treating them with a little bit more care. Let's put it this way. I've had my rant now.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for sharing your thoughts, your IMEC's concerns.
Ultimately, I just wanted to say thank you again for having me on the show. It's been a great pleasure. It's been a great pleasure to be able to talk through some of challenges we've experienced, but also it's been important for us to again raise a red flag, because whilst we worked really well with the Philippines in the last 10 to 15 years, there needs to be an understanding that the world out there is changing, and the Philippines need to change with it, because otherwise they run the risk of, as I said, pricing themselves out of the market.
Thanks again for joining the program.
Thank you.
That's Mr. Francesco Gargiulo, Chief Executive Officer of IMEC. I am Lynn Bacani. This is Maritime Viewpoints on Marino World Online.
Would you like to be a seafarer? Of course you would. It's a career like no other. Imagine setting sail from Manila as a full-time employee in a shipping company, bound for a destination on the other side of the world and meeting people from many different nationalities. Plus, knowing that you have chosen a career with a good salary and the opportunity to advance to higher positions. If you decide one day to come back ashore, the shipping industry offers plenty of opportunities for seafarers with the right experience. Seafaring is a career for life, and it's a very good one.